Howdy, and welcome to the next lecture. This is number 8 in the Alcohol and Intoxicants course. And today we're going to continue the discussion we had in class the other day about what happens to the culture of wine in the early church, in the early Middle Ages, and how does Christianity add to the complexity of culture, especially the ambivalence toward wine. How does it become a cardinal sin, drunkenness, in fact? And why? How does asceticism come into the story? How does perhaps the spite that the oppressed people, who the early Christians had, against the pleasure-loving, beauty-worshipping, powerful Romans, who were their oppressors, how did they turn the tables, perhaps, and really make those kind of drunken orgies into a sin? But basically what we're talking about now is what's happening back in Europe at the same time as that brilliant culture was flowering in Baghdad. Um, but we're going to need to look back just a little bit earlier. In fact, look at the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century AD. And first of all, we have to remember that the people we're talking about were violently oppressed. We're talking about the Jewish community at the time under Roman rule. In 70 AD, their temple was destroyed, their communities were dispersed. This is the whole meaning of the term diaspora. And they were sent out into the whole Roman Empire. They're all over the place, usually Greek speaking, interestingly. And this dispersal really caused the communities to focus away from the sacrificial religion that was maintained primarily by the priestly Levites, who, of course, had to worship in the temple. This now means that their method of worship had to change, and the had to move more toward education, more toward you might argue less toward ritual, more toward individual morality. And the people who replaced the Levite priests in the temple were called rabbis, and a rabbi really just means a teacher. It's not a special class or caste of people, and the places they worked are also quite different from a temple. We use these words interchangeably today, but in the past it would have meant something very different. The word in Greek, of course, is a synagogue. Okay, a synagogue. It's not a Hebrew word at all. It just means an assembly, so it's quite different. It's not a ritual place for ritual slaughter or the vast complex Levitical rites. This is actually just a place to learn, basically, and assemble and do prayers, of course. So the focus of many rituals, and I think this is actually very important for this story, things like the Passover, like the Sabbath, wine is of course central to these, but these shift. In fact, most worship shifts from the temple to the home. Okay, the Passover is a ritual you do at home, as is the Sabbath every Friday night. And in fact, many of these Jewish communities that I am speaking of go to places which will very shortly come under Muslim rule. So we're talking about places like Persia, Egypt, Spain, of course, after 711 is a place which formerly ruled by the Visigoths. Eventually the Muslims invade, and so these Jews are living under Muslim rule. And the reason I mention this is, again, to emphasize not only how the Jewish communities flourished under Islam, but how they could legally grow, supply, and of course consume alcohol in contexts where it was officially forbidden to Muslims. So they might nonetheless become their customers in places where those rules about growing or consuming wine are not so strictly enforced. So, and I would say also a similar situation held true for Christians as well. And I haven't, I have not mentioned Christianity yet, although it of course spreads through the Roman Empire, both east and west, and eventually, of all strangeness, it becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire with the backing of Constantine and then eventually official status. And with the acceptance of the Nicene Creed, that's under Theodosius in 380, and then of course the Trinity, the whole doctrine is invented in the Council of Nicaea. It becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, which should seem very odd after all that persecution. So, interestingly, it was the early Christians who sought to define the status of wine. especially because we saw in the Old Testament and the very early writings of the church, there's a kind of ambivalence there, right? Remember, Timothy was told, drink wine because it will settle your stomach. Did that mean everyone should, or is it just for people who are a little sick? And although we saw it was used in the sacrament, should it be a daily drink for everyone? I think many people suggested in class that because it becomes something sacred, abusing it becomes a little more serious. It's not just something you could have at dinner and drink as much as you want. It's actually it's a sacred thing now, and abusing it might be much more serious now. So. Um, Clement of Alexandria, he's a Christian writer of 150 to 215, provided some answers to these questions in his Pedagogus. It's the word pedagogy, means teachings, right? So let's first situate him in time and place, okay? Um, so Alexandria is in Egypt. Okay? It was founded by Alexander the Great. It was a very sophisticated Hellenistic city, meaning they spoke Greek, practiced Greek science and medicine, especially. It was a center for medicine. And much of the sort of scientific experimentation in the world at that time was taking place in Alexandria, anatomy especially, but also alchemy, which is, of course, central for our story. And remember those alchemists, early ones who maybe were playing with distillation? Alexandria is a very good choice for this to happen. But just as important, Alexandria was a center for Neoplatonic thought. In other words, the revival of Plato and the idea that there are abstract forms, which are the true and the good and the beauty, and they inform the things down here on earth. So, in any case, Clement, remember, he's a Greek, would have understood, of course, the whole tradition of the symposia and the whole Greek understanding of wine. He's part of that culture. He also certainly understood Greek medicine, goes back to Hippocrates and Galen, and the idea of wine being an analog to blood and the possibility that it's going to be very nutritious and therefore stimulate your libido and lead to sin, right? So Clement seems to have been most particularly concerned with young people who are drinking wine, and according to the humoral classification, young people are actually hot and moist to begin with. I know that sounds kind of gross, but remember that sort of lamp metaphor by Hippocrates, that people are born with a certain quantity of radical moisture and vital heat, and that it slowly burns off as they age, and then finally you're cold and dry and you die. But what it means is that if a person is temperamentally, their constitution is hot and moist, wine, which is also hot and moist, is not only going to be bad for them, it's going to push them into a dyscrasia, which means sickness. But it also causes, he thought, the reproductive organs of young people to mature too quickly. So let me read you. I'll read you Clement. He's a trip. It is proper, therefore, that boys and girls should keep as much away as possible from this medicine. I think if he's calling it medicine, right? For it is not right to pour into the burning season of life the hottest of all liquids, which is wine, adding, as it were, fire to fire. Completely medical understanding here, okay? For hence, wild impulses and burning lusts and fiery habits are kindled, and young men inflamed from within become prone to the indulgence of vicious propensities, so that signs of injury appear in their body, the members of lust coming to maturity sooner than they ought. The breasts and organs of generation, inflamed with wine, expand and swell in a shameful way. Remember who these people are. Remember, they're clergymen. They can't have sex, right? So they're a little angry about those who can. And already exhibiting beforehand the image of fornication, and the body compels the wound of the soul to inflame, and shameless pulsations follow abundance, inciting the man of correct behavior to transgression. And hence the voluptuousness of youth overpasses the bounds of modesty, and we must, as far as possible, try to quench the impulses of use by removing the Bacchic fuel of the threatened danger, and by pouring the antidote to the inflammation. So we keep down the burning soul and keep in the swelling members, and allay the agitation of lust when it is already in commotion. So he's arguing that wine is very dangerous for youths, not to be taken regularly, and in fact, only on occasion to combat the cold, especially at night, if it's a medicine. Okay? Exactly the opposite, of course, is the case for the elderly. Remember, they're already cold and dry and a little shriveled up, so a little heating medicine is good for them. And the saying of the day was vinum laxenum est, meaning wine is the milk of old people. So it actually is very good for them. Wine is the milk of old age, something later physicians repeat always. Okay, and this is what he says: those who are already advanced in life may partake more hilariously of the bowl. I love that phrase. To warm the harmless medicine of the vine, the chill of age, which the decay of time has produced. So old Clement's allowed to take it, but not young people. Um, but Clement also gives us a strident warning against drinking too much. Okay, excesses become really suspect. It's not something you do, when you want to have a Bacchic revel anymore. So, an immoderate quantity of wine, by an immoderate quantity of wine, the tongue is impeded, the lips are relaxed, the eyes roll wildly, the sight, as it were, swimming through the quantity of moisture, and compelled to deceive, they think that everything is revolving around them, and cannot count distant objects as single. So remember, you see double. And in truth, methinks I see two suns, said the Theban old man in his cups. For the sight, being disturbed by the heat of the wine, frequently fancies the substance of one object to be manifold, and there is no difference between moving the eye or the object seen, for both have the same effect on sight, which, on account of the fluctuation, cannot accurately obtain a perception of the object. And the feet are carried from beneath the man as by a flood, and hiccuping and then vomiting and maudlin nonsense follows. So, of course, he's saying, if you happen to be in a situation where you are presented with wine and have an opportunity to drink, be very careful. Be temperate. Okay, a little is an okay thing, but wine in excess is really corrupting. So let me read another passage. He's great. The miserable wretches who expel temperance from conviviality think excess in drinking to be the happiest of life, and their life is nothing but revel, debauchery, baths, excess, urinals, idleness, drink. I don't know what the urinals part is, because you have to pee a lot or something. You may see some of them half drunk, staggering with crowns round their necks like wine jars, vomiting drink on one another in the name of good fellowship, and others full of the effects of their debauch, dirty, pale-in-faced, livid, and still above yesterday's bout, pouring another bout to last till next morning. It is well, my friends, it is well to make our acquaintance with this picture at the greatest possible distance from it, and to frame ourselves what is better, dreading lest we also become like a spectacle and laughing stock to others. So he says, understand, watch what idiots these people are when they get drunk and vomit, because you don't want to be like that. You don't want to be someone else's laughing stock. So beware. It's frightening you, of course, into social degradation. So you can see where we are right now. We're at this really interesting intersection of Greek and Roman values and Judeo Christian values, two very separate traditions up until this point. And I think Clement seems kind of conflicted, right? He's not against drinking at all, and he understands it as medicinal value. And in his mind, Jesus, of course, drank and taught people at banquets, and so did Socrates, actually, right? They were drinking at a symposium. But nonetheless, he says moderation is absolutely essential here. Not abstinence, but reason and proper use in a medicinal context, and of course, if you're the proper age, right? But above all, the thing that he really finds dangerous, and again, I think, consider his position as a clergyman and as celibate, he finds an intoxicated woman especially dangerous, because she will not conceal her shame, and she becomes, in his mind, licentious. Okay, this is the danger of what happens when women drink too much. This is a real fear in his mind. So let's go a little deeper into what's going on in the mind of Clement and other early Christians. Tertullian is another very good example, who begin to define rigorously these terms: gluttony, inebriation, and why, in fact, we also call it intoxication. Toxic means poison, right? And I should point out here, Clement was actually not an ascetic. Okay, he's not someone punishing his body to make his spirit greater. He's not one of these, sort of heroic ascetic figures. But there are numerous others who really think the whole point is self-denial, right? They go out into the desert like Saint Anthony. They go up columns like Saint Simeon. He went onto a column and stayed there, never left. Sometimes they lived in separate communities that were isolated from the rest of the world. You have to separate yourself from the abomination. And they took vows there of celibacy, staying up long hours of the night to say masses, fasting, sometimes very long, sometimes perpetual fasts. I mean, obviously you can't stop eating altogether, but you can give up meat, which is going to stimulate your libido because it's very nutritious. And in fact, it's an interesting point. We'll come back to this, but it's technically a heresy to be a vegetarian, because there are places where Jesus says all food is good, right? Don't worry about avoiding pork anymore. But they will go into these ascetics will go to great lengths basically to atone for the sins of other people. They scourge the body, they punish themselves, and the whole idea is you attain a kind of purity by this. And of course, you call the attention of God, who looks down and says, wow, these people are really sorry for the awful things they did. And there's these special people who are praying to me for them, and he appreciates that, I guess. So, but let me give you an example of these early ascetics. So they said of Abba Macarius that if he was called among the brothers, he made a rule for himself thus: if wine could be had, he used to drink it for the brother's sake, and then for 1 cup of wine he would after go without water for a whole day. In other words, he feels bad that he had a little taste of wine, so he's not gonna. And the brothers, wanting to refresh him, used to give him wine, and the old man took it with joy, so as later to crucify himself. So he accepts the wine so only he can make himself feel really, really bad afterwards and atone for doing that, okay? But his disciple, knowing the reason, said to the brothers, for God's sake, I beg you, do not give it to him. In the cell afterwards, he tames himself with torments. And when the brothers knew it, they then gave him no more wine, okay? So it was better just let the guy, don't give him wine, so he'll drink a little water and won't really, really punish himself. So they told Abba Poiman that a certain monk did not drink wine, and he said to them, wine is not for monks at all. The pleasures of the wealthy world must not seduce you, as if those pleasures were useful. Because of this pleasure they honor the art of cooking, but by rigorous fasting you should trample those pleasures. Never be sated with bread, nor want wine. Okay, so it's clear that wine is around, right? They need it for the sacrament, okay? But it's extremely suspect when it's drunk for the purpose of pleasure. Not only do monks avoid it, but they seem to get a kind of malicious pleasure from denying themselves a drink, okay, and going thirsty. And I want you to think again about what's really going on in the minds of these men. They have taken vows not to enjoy pleasures or even necessities, biological necessities like sleep and enough food, and of course reproduction, right, is not part of what they do or the pleasures associated with it. And they consider that this denial makes their soul stronger. It gives them a kind of power over those other weak people who all indulge in drink and fornication. So doesn't this again derive from, in some level, from spite? And I'm drawing, of course, on the ideas of the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who was himself a basket case. But apart from that, I think he's got it right. His idea of the slave morality, that at some level these ascetic priests are all jealous of everyone who gets to drink and have fun, so they make abstinence a virtue, okay? Even though